Gwyn Creedy.
I'm a writer. I'm writing a memoir about getting to know my sister Claire, who died when she was 31. It's hard to lose a sister. You think you have your whole life to get to know someone, but you don't. But talking to people who were close to her in her 20s when I wasn't has been a real gift. So a lot of stories get unearthed when you write a memoir, and there's one I'm very fond of, though it's only tangentially related to the memoir's core narrative. But it's a good story, and it says so much about friendship. It's about my mother and stepmother. I start this story in the middle because that's where I started in it. I was in 9th grade, living with my father, brother, and sister in a house in Mount Lebanon. It was a sunny Sunday in June. An enormous Cadillac pulled into our driveway as long as a tugboat, driven by a tiny woman with a big bouffant hairdo. That was my introduction to Jean Lowther. Jean and my dad were old friends. She'd left her husband, who was cheating on her. Her kids were grown and she needed a place to land. My father disliked her husband and her husband disliked my father. Jean moving in was my dad's idea of a well-deserved poke in the eye. Jean and my dad became a couple, and just like that, I had a new stepmother. Jean was odd, but a good kind of odd. And for the first time since my parents divorced when I was in 5th grade, and my mom died in 7th grade, and my dad remarried and divorced when I was in 8th grade, I felt like I had some stability in my life. Jean was there when I left for the University of Chicago. She was there 4 years later when Claire left for Bard. She was there when I married my husband. By the way, the lady in the red hat, my dad's second wife. Awkward. Jean and my dad broke up a few years after I got married. Jean moved to an apartment in Canonsburg to be near her son, and at that point she retreated a bit from our lives. She had her own kids and grandkids, but I talked to her every few weeks, and we saw each other several times a year. By the way, my sister took this picture, and I just loved it. The breakup didn't really change things too much between Jean and me. She was there when I had my kids, and we could always count on her to babysit, though it was a long drive to Canonsburg to get her. She didn't have the caddy anymore, and she didn't like to drive. Jean was the first person I called when my sister died, and the first 5 years later when my dad followed. She came to the anniversary party my husband and I threw for our 20th. We rented a stretch limo to take her back to Canonsburg that night. It was the first time she'd ever been in a limo, and she talked about it often afterward. Jean's life, like mine, had a vein of tragedy in it. One of Jean's daughters committed suicide. The other died waiting for a liver transplant. One of her granddaughters died of meningitis, and her other grandchildren moved with their father and lost touch. Jean rarely talked about those things, but I knew they hurt. Jean and her ex-husband Ed started dating again on and off. It made Jean happy, so it made me happy. Jean's son, her last child, took good care of her, driving her to the beauty parlor every week, and food shopping and doctor's appointments. Jean and Ed were on their way to a friend's funeral when Ed had a heart attack and died in Jean's arms. Jean grew older, and so did we. It got harder to convince her to let us take her out, so we didn't see her as often. I still talked to her on the phone, though, and she always loved to chat. One day I couldn't reach her, and I called her son. "She's too sick to live alone," he said. "She's in a nursing home now." Selfishly, this pleased me, not the sick part, the nursing home. Now we could visit her whenever we wanted, and my husband and I went regularly. We'd bring her a vanilla latte, which she loved, and sometimes our dog Socks, whom she also loved. She was always happy to see us and eager for news. Once when we visited her, there was a lull in the conversation. I asked her how her son was. She hesitated. "He's gone," she said. "I'm sorry, I thought you knew. He died 2 months ago." I looked at my husband, aghast. We'd visited her several times since his death, and she'd never said a word. I realized with a shock that my husband and I were now Jean's only caretakers. I was more than happy to step into the role, but never in my life had I imagined I would be called upon to do it. We started visiting every week. We handled her money and helped her navigate the doctors and nurses, and she was always, always happy to see us. After 2 years in the nursing home, on a sunny Sunday in June, Jean died. I visited her that morning. She gave me the biggest hug she'd ever given me, a clutching, two-armed monster of a hug, and she asked me to leave. She knew, I didn't. I told you I started the story in the middle. My father knew Jean because my mother, Carol Scott, was Jean's best friend. Jean and Carol met in elementary school in Dormont. They grew up together, dated together, and even sort of got married together, with Jean wearing a bridesmaid's dress in my parents' wedding, and my mother wearing the same dress in Jean's. But their husbands didn't like one another, and after they got married, they drifted apart. Jean and my mother never spoke again until 20 years later, when Jean heard my mother was dying of leukemia. Jean came to say goodbye. She asked my mother what she could do for her, and my mother said, "Could you clean my oven?" And Jean did. 3 years later, Jean moved into our house. Could either of them have ever guessed when they were in 5th grade that Jean would end up taking care of Carol's daughters after Carol died, and that Carol's daughter would end up taking care of Jean? If that's not proof of magic in the world, I don't know what is. The arc of friendship is long, but it bends relentlessly toward love.